Welcome to Pick of the Pods, the podcast. This is the audio companion to the Pick of the Pods newsletter, which delivers your weekly recommendation of the one podcast you should be listening to right now. Find it on Substack or LinkedIn. Look for Pick of the Pods. On this, the podcast version, we speak to the people who make some of those great podcasts to find out how they do what they do and to hear about what they're listening to. On this episode, we're talking to one of the hosts of The Story of Money, a fairly new podcast from the Financial Times. His name is Robin Wigglesworth. Hi, Robin. How are you?
Hi, how are you, Robin? Good to have two Robins here.
It is. That I don't think in 6 years of podcasting I've had another Robin on, so...
we should have another one. We can do a sort of Robins Assemble special edition.
That's right. We do have superpowers, we know that.
Yeah.
It's a great podcast. Really enjoyed it. I recommended it on the Pick of the Pods newsletter a few weeks ago. Tell us, what is The Story of Money?
Well, the TLDR is its financial history, but we try to do it both, a bit of history for finance nerds, the classic FT reader, but also, financial aspects for history buffs. I came into journalism, financial journalism, almost by chance, and for me, understanding finance and economics, it was like seeing the hidden wiring of the world. You kind of understood the world a little bit better when you understood the world of money. And I studied history. History was always my first love. And as Cat Stevens sang, the first cut is the deepest. But, sometimes the world of history and history buffs, they ignore the financial aspects of things. And I think that's wrong because you don't really see the full spectrum of colors, the amazing stuff that happens. You don't understand the world and what's happened unless you understand the money bits as well. So that's what we're trying to do with the pod.
I mean, it's such an important part of human history, isn't it?
Yeah.
You think about what makes civilization, farming, from hunter-gathering to farming, language development, but the creation and use of money is an absolute cornerstone of all of our civilization.
It's sort of one of the social technologies, along with language and politics and all these things. It's so foundational, and I think historians are more and more recognizing that fact, that somehow the way we always thought that money was invented after barter, the classic story that we used to exchange rocks and food and grain and horses, and then we've invented money and credit and debt to make things easier. Well, no, actually went the other way around. Basically, as long as we have sort of recorded human history, we have examples of quite vivid financial systems, even going back to Mesopotamia and the Dalman civilization of the Gulf and in Africa. Money has always been there, debt has always been there, finance has always been there with us, and actually helps explain a lot more than maybe some people realize.
Yeah, you mentioned exchanging rocks. The particular episode that I recommended in Pick of the Pods, the Substack, was this one of giant rocks. People always talk about seashells or coloured stones or something, but these people on an island in the South Pacific were actually exchanging, sometimes they literally did exchange, huge rocks. I mean, that an extraordinary story. How did you stumble across that one?
Well, I knew it because it's sort of almost... we were worried about doing it as an early episode because I feel it's such a well-known story in financial circles, but maybe not elsewhere. It's, like you say, we've always had various things that we've used as money, whether silver or cigarettes in prison or whatever. Money's a far more flexible concept than people realize. And Yap, a tiny Pacific island, used these massive round stones with holes in the middle. And they could be from a foot in size or to like 8 feet. They're huge. I mean, they're so big you can't actually move them. And I think, it became a bit of a cool celebrity because people like John Maynard Keynes and others heard about this and thought it was delightful because it shows something, a more universal truth in that. What does this island and its currency say anything about us today? Well, on one hand, nothing. But on the other hand, it says everything. Because it shows that actually money can be disentangled from the object. Any object can be considered money or have value. And it can actually form a system of credit. Because it wasn't these islanders of Yap, they weren't just kind of exchanging stones when they were buying and selling from each other. They often didn't move the stones. And most famously, there was a boat that came with 2 of these big stones and it sank. And everybody agreed that the family still owned those 2 stones. They just happened to be in the seabed. and they were still allowed to use them as credit, as collateral to buy and sell things. And the ownership of those stones, because it was a small, tight-knit community, they just changed. And I think it says something quite powerful about how, even what we consider fairly rudimentary societies have always had and used credit in quite imaginative ways.
It's kind of, I don't know, probably one of you made the joke, but it's kind of the blockchain, isn't it? Those blocks of stone fell to the bottom of the ocean, that they were still acknowledged as of value, and transactions happened around them. And I guess the emergence of cryptocurrencies as well has a lot of people asking today, what is money? I mean, some people never ask it. You get paid, you buy stuff, things cost more, you're looking for more money. But unless you've studied economics or the history of human civilization, probably not that many people are thinking, what is money? But I think the emergence of crypto has really made a lot more people think, hold on, this piece of paper obviously can't be worth $100.
Yeah. No, it's an old joke by now, but, people in the crypto people, I feel they almost like relearning at super speeds everything we've learned about finance over the millennia. There is nothing new under the sun. One of the working titles of our podcast was "This has all happened before," essentially. Right. And crypto is a great case, like money and what is money and how it functions and how its functions can change, and sometimes money can die, is kind of a bit of a running thread throughout the pod. We try not to link everything into crypto, because you could do so much, but we did an episode on wildcat banking. Basically, banks used to obviously create their own currencies, and back in the day there wasn't a lot of stringent regulation on that, so you'd be shocked at how many banks just created money out of nothing. And even when people knew it was funny money, even when people knew it was dodgy, people still kind of, it's useful. We need something to be money. This is something. We don't have enough silver coins, so let's just use this wink and a nod funny money as currency. And it kind of works for a while until it obviously then doesn't. The US suffered several massive catastrophic banking crises where, almost entire financial system collapsed. And crypto is kind of discovering this all over again, that you can create money. You can create something that people treat as money, whether it's, conch shells, stones, round stones, ones and zeros in a blockchain ledger, cigarettes, but that doesn't essentially hide you or protect you from some of the weird stuff that the world can sometimes afflict on money and you.
Well, let's listen to the first clip. I ask all my guests on Pop the Podcast to bring in 3 clips from their shows. This one, you just mentioned Keynes, I believe, coming through. Not many conversations about economics can get away without mentioning him. Nope. It's one of those things, I brushed with economics at university, and the most I know about Keynes was, he's the one who said you could pay someone to dig a hole and fill it in, that kind of Keynesian economy. I don't know much about him as a person. I learned a lot more from this particular episode. Could you just introduce it to it, and then we'll hear a little bit of it. This is an episode called The Bretton Woods Agreement, a tale of boozing, womanizing, espionage, and a heart attack. And I think that's where Keynes comes in. What were you trying to do with this episode?
Well, we want to use people and events to tell a broader story, right? I mean, we're a narrative podcast. We want to tell a great yarn, essentially. But we also want to teach people and learn about these fascinating events that have shaped the world we live in today. There are some episodes that are obviously impactful and others are fairly niche, like we do some very specific things that are just fun and delightful and fascinating, but not important on a global scale. But the Bretton Woods Agreement, that kind of was the global financial settlement for the post-World War II order, is one of the most important agreements in the history of mankind. And it just set up the entire world and what it looked like after the end of hostilities. It was in 1994 in the United States in New Hampshire.
1944.
44, sorry, yes, 1944. And John Maynard Keynes was basically the de facto head of the UK delegation to Bretton Woods to front the British view. So you had both, he had to represent what the English thought about things, because frankly, England was obviously utterly and completely bankrupt at that point, and the US was the financial hyperpower of the era. So he had to kind of fight for debtors' rights, which was a change of pace for the Brits, because they'd obviously been the world's creditors for a couple of centuries before then. But then he also had these things. He wanted to fix some of the problems in the international economic order that he felt had caused the Great Depression and therefore led to the rise of the Nazi parties and the far right in large parts of Europe and the Soviet Union as well, for that matter. So they had huge ambitions, and it was a crazy episode. Like even Keynes called Bretton Woods a monstrous monkey house. Because basically you took sort of a couple of hundred technocrats and central bankers and finance ministry officials, locked them up in a hotel in the middle of a war, stocked full with booze, and let's be honest, lots of female secretaries, not all of which were there to take down notes. And it was a complete carnival, really. But out of it came this incredible agreement.
Let's hear a bit of it then. Your guest, so you're here with your co-host, Gillian Tett, also the Financial Times, and your kind of expert witness who's written a book on the subject is the Sky News finance correspondent, Ed Conway.
The US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, died in April 1945, and then 3 months later, the UK also changed its government, with Clement Attlee's Labour government coming into power. So what happened to Britain?
Well, it's left in a pretty parlous financial condition. Keynes continues to serve under the Labour government, and he gets sent back to Washington to try and come up with a post-war loan for Britain. He is in even worse physical condition than he was last time around. And yet, for some reason, he's asked to lead these negotiations. I mean, whoever did that was desperately regretting that very shortly afterwards, because he then conducts some of the worst economic negotiation known to humanity and basically shows his hand right from the start. It later transpires, by the way, that he was on a type of medication called sodium amytal, which was kind of a drug that was there for his heart, which taken in large enough quantities actually is a truth serum. So that might explain partly why his negotiation is so bad. But nonetheless, he totally flunks it and ends up with the loan on quite harsh conditions that involve having to allow sterling to be freely convertible much sooner than he would have liked, which is ultimately what sets Britain on the road towards kind of decades of economic kind of crises in the following years.
So that was an episode from The Story of Money, an episode about the Bretton Woods Agreement. And Bretton Woods, we often heard it spoken about, usually the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. I don't think I was even aware, and it's embarrassing because you said, everyone knows about the big rocks on Yap. I'd never heard of that before. Well, I've heard of Bretton Woods, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. Turns out it's a hotel on top of a hill in New Hampshire, which it sounds like, and this is mentioned at least twice in that episode, it's like The Shining, where the little boy is driving his car down. Gillian Tett says she took her children on holiday there once, or she was working there was some meeting and her children were running rampage around. That's quite an amusing anecdote. But
and one of her children also bombed Paul Volcker, the former Fed chair, in the swimming pool at Bretton Woods, which, look, if I live to be 100, I'll probably never have a story as good as that.
Exactly. So the episode is worth it, full of things like that. Yeah, I mean, don't want to give the ending of The Shining, well, not the ending, even the beginning of The Shining away. He does go nuts with an axe, and he's drinking a lot of alcohol. No evidence there was any axe murdering going on at the Bretton Woods conference. Tell us about how you pick your subjects, because The Story of Money, when I first saw this, I came aware of the podcast a couple of months ago, shortly after you'd launched it, I think. I thought, I know what they'll do. They'll go back to Stone Age man kind of trading in, woolly mammoth skins or something, and they'll bring it through over the months and years to the present day. You've clearly not done that. You are jumping around from interesting moment hundreds of years ago to very recent past. How do you decide what to focus on?
Well, it probably won't shock you to know it's more art than science. It's largely driven by our interest, what we think people will be interested in. And what can be turned into a narrative podcast. If we want to keep people's attention for an entire hour, you need to kind of make it interesting and fascinating. And the way to do that is to tell a story through people. And I think sometimes people think the world of money and finance and economics is irredeemably boring. And I always say that this is completely wrong. It's fascinating and vivid and interesting beyond belief. And that's what we want to capture. And we deliberately do want to span everything from sort of Mesopotamian clay tablets that wrote down loans, tradable loans for 6,000 years ago almost, to something fairly modern, like the invention of credit default swaps or Bretton Woods. We want to go from debt crises in Latin America to the invention of paper money in China. We want to span geographically as well. We want to go for those stories that really help people today understand the world we live in, what the future might look like, by understanding where we came from as well. I mean, it's an overused quote that from George Santayana or Winston Churchill, depending on your favorite form. To understand the future, we have to understand the past and ideally not make the same mistakes we've done before.
Okay, let's hear a second clip then. This one is much more, considerably more recent. Always seems much more recent when it's in your own lifetime, doesn't it? But
yes.
Actually, so this one is called "The Financial Scams That Brought Albania to the Brink of War." Albania, there's a country we don't hear much from.
No.
Tell us about this episode.
Well, so this was definitely one driven by my own interests. So Albania in the 1990s, when it kind of emerged from the fall of the Iron Curtain, this was a country that, even by the standards of Eastern Europe, was isolated. It's more akin to a North Korea, really. Completely cut off, even from the Eastern Bloc. They had no experience of anything. And suddenly they were supposed to be free and learn about capitalism and markets and things like that. And what ensued was, frankly, just a gigantic catastrophe. The entire country got engulfed by a series of Ponzi schemes, the size of which are mind-boggling. It's a bit like, I think I calculated, it's over 1,000 Bernie Madoffs, the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time, all going off at the same time in one tiny country. Pretty much everybody affected. And it collapsed so horrifically that it led to almost a civil war. And we didn't really hear that much about it because it's Albania, and obviously there were lots of things going on in the early 90s. You know, Ceausescu was getting strung up, and the Soviet Union was falling apart. But I just thought it's so vivid, so fascinating, so tragic, and also with some just delightfully weird elements as well, that I was really thrilled we could do an episode on this.
And this, you're interviewing an FT colleague, I believe.
Yes.
Ortenka Aliaj.
Yeah, Hortensia Aliaj is a banking editor, and she happens to be Albanian as well. So she fled in the wake of this almost near societal collapse of the Ponzi scheme. So she can only vaguely remember it, but obviously has grown up with the stories. And quite often our guests are people that were in the room, like an official in the Nixon administration, or a historian who's written a book or has studied a period. But it was really good to have that kind of the texture and granularity that somebody, who grew up out of this debacle could give to it, and Hortensia was wonderful, so I thought she really brought it to life.
Let's hear a clip from that episode.
Were there any banks in Albania?
Well, the short answer is yes, but they weren't very good banks.
Okay.
When communism fell, there were 3 state-run banks that were terrible because they lacked 2 key functions. They didn't really take in deposits, and they couldn't really lend.
Okay, I'm spotting a few weaknesses here in their business model. So in 1990, for Albania, it must have been just an enormous shock, right? Going from isolation, even in Eastern Europe, to suddenly the world changing.
The only way I can describe it, honestly, is like someone turning the lights on. My grandparents own a farm in the north of Albania. All of the produce that they made would be taken, redistributed, and all of a sudden, boom, Albania is open. We were now more often seeing Western market products in Albania. Adidas jackets, 2 other things dear to my heart. The Financial Times newspaper was spotted, as well as Coca-Cola bottles. The cool thing in Albania was to go to someone's house in the 90s and see that they had Coca-Cola bottles or cans, and they would use them like vases. These were really, really precious things.
We were listening there to an episode of The Story of Money called "The Financial Scams That Brought Albania to the Brink of War." On that, my guest Robin was speaking to his colleague Hortensa Aliage, who she mentions the Coca-Cola cans. I recently read, do you know the book by Leah Epi, who's currently at the London School of Economics, but her memoir called Free Coming of Age at the End of History, and the front cover of that, of the paperback of that, is a Coca-Cola can with a rose, and this was on her television set when she was a girl.
Oh, really? I haven't actually read Free yet, actually. It's supposed to be phenomenal, but
it's so good. It's so good, because what she does is, particularly if you know nothing about Albania, you know nothing about her, and I didn't, and I never read. I have a thing about reading books. I never read the back cover. I'll read what the critics are saying, you know, if there's a quote from whoever, but I never read the bit because it often just gives spoilers away. And if you crack on with this one, so you don't know who she is, or importantly who her family is, and I won't tell you if you've not read it, but you discover about, well, she discovers, interestingly, about halfway into this childhood memoir. It's such an interesting book, and talking about the time of what you were talking about in that episode. So interesting. So talking about guests on the show, let's talk about your co-host as well, Gillian Tett. Tell us something about her and what it's like to work with her.
It's wonderful. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm doing this is because I can do it with Gillian. So I never overlapped with her in London when I joined the FT. I joined the FT as a Middle East correspondent, actually, and came to London as a financial correspondent covering markets, but just when she went to the US. But I did go over to the US later when she was my boss, and she was phenomenal then. She's phenomenal today. Now she's the head of one of the Cambridge colleges. So she does this as part of
the one where Keynes was. She was able to say, "Oh yes, I was looking at his archive the other day." That was quite nice.
Quite often. So a running thread with Gillian is that she used to be an anthropologist, which is quite handy for a history of finance podcast, and also astonishing number of famous British people in politics and finance have studied at King's. So also Robert Walpole, the first Prime Minister, he figured quite heavily in an episode on the South Sea Bubble. He also went there, of course, and she's always able to get a bit of a King's plug-in, which I think is only fair enough.
Oh, they need the advertising, surely.
Yeah, so, I know. Yeah. King's, who's ever really heard of King's these days? Nobody cares, yeah.
So let's move towards the third clip. Talking of big names, so there are big economists, there are big politicians, you just mentioned. And this is an interesting title for an episode. They are history's geniuses, but were they any good at investing? And in this clip, we're talking about quite a big figure in British history, which is Winston Churchill. And everyone in the world probably has some notion of who Winston Churchill is. I think there's very, very different. If you've worked in the Middle East, Robin, you'll be aware that his reputation there is probably different from what it is back in Blighty, where we are both from.
Very true.
And he lived probably 5 or 6 different lives, didn't he? But what you're looking at here is his not great relationship with money.
No, he was catastrophically bad with money. And I think people that have maybe a passing knowledge of his life, like I had before we did this episode, knew that he was, not good with money. But I had not fully grasped what I think the modern term is degenerate he was when it came to trading. This was like, he is the most extreme leveraged day trading nutcase I've almost ever come across.
Could you do day trading back in his day? Is that?
Well, it was the equivalent of day trading.
Okay.
So you'd have to sell. You definitely needed a broker, but he was basically doing this. He went massively into debt. He was always in debt. He was always had to write books and write articles and give speeches to stay ahead of creditors. And then promptly also on a big tour in America in particular, he basically just caught the trading bug and spent large swaths of his large American tour gambling excessively and lost money all the time, but then in particular just got absolutely creamed by the great crash of 1929. And that's almost everybody got hit by 1929. What is astonishing was his appetite for highly leveraged, highly risky, and utterly irresponsible trading for years, even before that, and afterwards, I gather.
sounds intriguing. Let's take a listen to that.
I want to talk about Winston Churchill. And what kind of investor was he?
It really kind of makes your skin crawl, some of the things that he got up to along the way. Back in the day, journalists got paid phenomenally well. Churchill's per article going rate was about £750. If we whack that through the Bank of England's inflation calculator, around about sort of £43,000 on CPI linkage, or £200,000 on a wage linkage, or £480,000 on a GDP linkage. He was making serious mint. The kind of advances he was getting, if you CPI linked them, were over £7 million. Or
Wow.
GDP linked, close to £80 million. And he saw that money that was going to come and just seemed to go on a bender when it came to investing. He'd lost it all.
Oh, wow. He lost it all in the crash in the stock market? What?
No, just trading. His trading volume was sort of, just so intense. And that trading activity just saw him completely wiped out.
So that was a clip from The Story of Money, talking about Winston Churchill. Who are the other geniuses then? Because it was called They Are History's Geniuses. I haven't heard the whole episode yet of that one.
Well, it came out of one of my colleagues discovering that Charles Darwin had quite a lot of money to invest, reasonable well-to-do money, and had done incredibly well. So we started digging into various other people that we knew about. So they were famous for something else. So Charles Darwin, obviously, the origins of the species, one of the history's geniuses. Well, what about the rest? So we found out J.W.M. Turner, the painter, phenomenal investor, but more of a trader, and very cunning. He did basically bond arbitrage trades that were very cunning for the era. And then, we had Winston Churchill. There was John Maynard Keynes, who we've already talked about. He was a phenomenal manager of Cambridge's endowment, or King's Endowment. He first started trading too much. He was not if a day trader, but he traded too much. He thought he was cleverer than the market. And over time, he settled in. So his early results were bad to abysmal, but then he really found his groove and something that worked, and frankly did astonishingly well for King's Endowment. There are other people that we don't have enough details to look into. So Marie Curie as well. Albert Einstein invested some of his Nobel Prize in an apartment block. So we just look basically at what these people did with their money and whether genius in one area translates into something else. Because sometimes you might think so, even if it's maybe not J.W.M. Turner, but art is so different. But Isaac Newton, one of the great geniuses, mathematical geniuses of any era ever, one of the great humans of all time, but also, quite a bit of a trader, and he got sucked into the South Sea bubble, and tragically, he knew it was a bubble. He got out of the bubble, and then he saw it just kept inflating, and this just shows that human nature just warps all of us. So that famous quote, from the crooked timber of mankind, never a straight thing is made. And even Isaac Newton saw everybody else around him get richer and richer, and jumped back in with all his money just before the bubble burst, and he got cleaned out. So he still died wealthy, but he would have died a lot wealthier if he hadn't been sucked in by the South Sea bubble.
Sucked in by the gravitational... I bet you made that joke. I haven't, as I said, by the gravitational pull of a rising, expanding bubble.
Well, there's a very famous Isaac Newton quote to say, "I can calculate the motion of celestial bodies, but not the madness of people," including himself, it seems.
Right. Excellent. Okay, well, there's 3 great episodes for listeners to this to go and listen to. Also, the one that I put on the Pick of the Pods Substack, the one about the big stones. Let's talk about podcasting in general then, Robin. You, like I was a Reuters journalist for 20 years. You've been an FT correspondent. Is this your first foray into podcasting, and how did you get into it?
Yes, as a podcast host, as it were. So I've occasionally co-hosted or guest hosted. I've been a guest on many podcasts. But I think it's very fair to say that I have a face for radio and a voice for print.
Oh, come now. I often do the face for radio one, but at least I say my voice is okay.
Oh, well, we all hate our own voices, of course. But for me, podcast has just been a fun thing to learn, essentially.
Yeah.
It's one of the great things about journalism, as you know as well as I do, is that you get to learn new things. You get paid to study, and I like learning stuff, and I like learning to do new things. And for me, this was just a wonderful chance to learn something new with somebody who I love and respect greatly, and just a phenomenal audio team at the FT. So it was super exciting. And then when you also had, one of my favorite subjects, I love history and I love finance, and financial history is sort of one of my passions. It sounds super nerdy, but it's true. It was hard to not giddily say yes when Rula Khalaf, the FT's editor, asked me if I could do this.
And I feel that podcasting fills lots of roles, but one of the roles it fills is filling that attention span deficit that people have. That, we used to read a physical newspaper, then some of us carried on reading online a newspaper. Most people, including, I bet, the two people who are on this call right now, get a lot of our quotes, news, content, information by, the length of a tweet, even if it's not on Twitter anymore. And I think, and it's your job to be a journalist and to get into this stuff. A lot of people it's not, and really most people's attention spans, and I do feel it hitting me. I do still read books, and I do still read articles, but I do feel my attention span, it's a muscle I've got to stretch. And I find that podcasts can be a way of, okay, I can happily spend 45 minutes, an hour listening to this, to the history of Bretton Woods or something.
No, I agree completely. I still read a lot, albeit not as many books as I did pre-children. Maybe if you include children's books. But,
right.
But I agree with that. The attention span is frankly a muscle that we all probably need to stretch and fight against shortening. And I can see, look, for me, it's the rise of short form video in journalism is everywhere. And I think we just need to roll with it. That's how people increasingly sort of discover new things. But what I do love about podcasts, it is a refuge for length and nuance and depth that is impossible to do even in long form video. That, like, a long video is 10 minutes, but like a podcast, we do episodes that are routinely over an hour long. We do double headers, we're planning triple headers. We can go unapologetically deep and let that sort of the texture, the color, the nuance, the complexity of the real world shine through. And I think that is something that is probably even easier on podcasts than it is in print. That in print, like anything over 4,000 words starts getting almost like people joke as a book. And that's why I think for me, podcast has been a joyful experience, is because I like doing nuance. I like doing complexity. I like doing depth. I like trying to understand the world and help other people understand in the same way as I have. And podcast is just a tremendous medium to do so.
Tell us a bit about your path to this then, a potted history of your career. Probably should have started with this, but everyone's interested now that they've heard what you produce. So you mentioned you worked in the Middle East as a reporter. Give us a potted history.
Well, I never wanted to be a financial journalist. I knew a little bit of economics because I understood that this was important. But I remember I studied journalism and history and international relations at City University and at the LSE. And I remember there was a City editor from one of the big broadsheets that came in. I'm not going to name him. It was a lovely guy, but he was desperately trying to sell financial journalism as a career course. And his way of doing so was that you can have really long lunches. Long boozy lunches.
Yeah.
And like, I'm sure that was very attractive for a man in his late 60s, but we were all young idealistic journalists and the journalism students in the early 2000s. So I always wanted to be a war correspondent or cover write music magazine pieces. But where the jobs were in the early 2000s were in financial journalism, and I found a job for a banking magazine in Dubai whilst working as a freelancer for The Guardian. And well, I'd studied lots of Middle East politics. I'd studied a bit of Arabic. I'd studied political Islam, things like that. And I thought, well, Dubai is the least Middle Eastern part of the Middle East, but this could be fascinating. And literally my first day, I fell in love with finance and financial journalism, because again, it is that thing that you are paid to learn about things. It's fascinating, and it's always changing. So that was a small trade magazine. I then went to Bloomberg News in Scandinavia. I'm from Oslo originally, so I speak fluent Norwegian, so I covered economics and politics for the Scandinavian region. And then I joined the FT as a Middle East correspondent in the Gulf in 2008. And I've been very happily at the FT ever since then. I started off as a Middle East person, but since basically 2011, 12, I've been all finance all the way. Finance, economics, business, investing, markets. It's just unendingly fascinating. And then especially when I can marry it with my first love of history.
Do you still edit the Alphaville blog? Is that you?
Yeah, so I'm the editor of Alphaville. The FT has its own finance blog, so we're a small team of people, and I edit that out of Oslo, Norway, where I live now. So I try to combine that with the podcast. Sometimes it's a bit of an awkward mix, but the one thing that they both allow is us to have fun and go deep and be thorough and embrace complexity rather than run away from it. As in, we don't want to tell complex stories or make things difficult for listeners or readers, but we want to take what are complex, difficult subjects that quite often, if we're being honest, a lot of journalists shy away from. And try to explain them, why these things are important, why they're fascinating, why you should care. Because I think sometimes, especially finance and economics, have almost deliberately or accidentally erected walls of misinformation or misunderstanding around them to sort of guard against the outsiders. And frankly, I think that is societally extremely harmful. So we try to do our tiny little bit to fight against that by writing about the big, important, if maybe sometimes seemingly complex stuff.
So what podcast do you listen to? I hope you got my memo asking for 2 recommendations. I'm asking people for an Eat Your Greens podcast that makes you a better person, it educates you or I don't know, just lifts you up somehow, and one that's maybe just purely entertaining. I give people, you don't have to... I mean, I was asked recently to recommend 3 podcasts, and I listen to just countless podcasts, and I realised my 3 top ones were pure entertainment. So,
yeah.
But fire away. What have you got for us?
Oh yeah, no, I was thinking about this just because obviously Eat Your Greens and entertainment, they're the same thing. I'm one of those people. I don't read non-fiction anymore. I'm a classic of the middle-aged dad buyer of books, and I think of listener of podcasts. So for me, the Eat Your Greens are the enjoyable ones. The rest is history. I'm sure lots of people mention it. I wish I could come up with something remotely original, but it is tremendous. Just both the gravitas they bring to it, the passion. You really notice they love this stuff, and I love that shining through. I think journalists should occasionally let that shine through more often, and it's quite telling that these are 2 professional historians. They're just tremendous, and even subjects I'm not that interested in, they do a really good job. Because of my wife, we used to live in the United States. We listen still to a lot of American podcasts. The rest is politics, US, for example, and the UK one. They are kind of maybe more Eat Your Greens. Sometimes I find myself also cowed by the sheer amount of noise and news, or noise masquerading as news and news masquerading as noise, that emanates from the UK and US body politic these days. So I guess those are more the pure Eat Your Greens ones, where I don't derive a ton of pleasure listening to them, even though the hosts are phenomenal. But I do that to stay an informed human being. I try to, at least. And when it comes to like the pure entertainment, like I said, I don't do a lot of pure entertainment-y stuff. But I have to admit, one of the podcasts I'll just give them a shout out, just because I've enjoyed it a lot with my children, is National Geographic's Greeking Out. So a long series of Greek mythology and gods and stories, and my kids have loved it, and it's just incredibly well done. Like, I'm not the target audience, but mildly, but I can still really admire the craft of getting the mix of actually depth and nuance and like proper academic sort of grounding. They don't shy away from some of the nasty stuff in Greek mythology, but while still making it fun and lively for, adults and kids alike. So I think that's just an incredibly well done podcasts that my kids aged 4 to 13 have all enjoyed, and that's quite a hard mix, especially when you try and hit the middle-aged 45-year-old dads as well.
Right, Greeking out. Right, I'll
Greeking
check that out. As for the Rest Is podcast you mentioned, The Rest Is Politics was episode 1 of Pick of the Pods, the podcast. I had a producer from that show come on, and the rest is history. I've yet to approach them, but I will in due course. That's you're right. I think probably about half the people I've had on so far have recommended that. I'm a big fan of it as well.
Yeah, I wish I could be original and say something. I thought about, shall I try and find some deep cuts? There are smaller podcasts out there that probably deserve more of a shout out. But when I think of something I consistently return to as, frankly, a standard, something that we on the Story of Money aspire to, it is The Rest is History.
Right.
I think they're phenomenal. So yeah, hopefully we'll get there or get near within touching distance at some point.
Let's see if the other question in my Desert Island Discs style format is, you can make an episode, a podcast about anything you want. For some people, that means who's your dream interview, kind of alive or dead or fantasy. It doesn't have to be that. It could be just make up a whole format. The world is your oyster. If you could make one episode, what would it be?
Can I choose somebody who's already died as an interviewee?
Definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so we did do one podcast for the Story of Money on the railway boom and bust of 1873. It was one of the great big financial crises that we've kind of forgotten a bit today, but it was called the Depression, the Great Depression, until the actual Great Depression started, and the crash that followed 1873 is now just known as the Long Depression. And it also has a very sort of modern echoes with one big investment bank, J. Cook & Co., that went bankrupt. It was kind of the Lehman Brothers of the day, but really it was kind of the Lehman Brothers and the JP Morgan and the Barclays and the HSBC all put together. He was the Titanic financier of the 19th century up until that point. He almost single-handedly helped bankroll the Union's victory in the Civil War, the American Civil War. And he went well over his skis on the railway bonds, and the bank went bankrupt, and that kind of triggered just a financial cataclysm that rippled across the world. It's also arguably one of the first truly global financial crises as well. But Jay Cook, the main guy, I've recently written a book on the history of the bond market that's coming out later in September, and there's so many fascinating characters from sort of the 12th century Venice to the present day that I would have loved to interview. Either they had passed away or they refused to talk to me, and some people I did talk to. But Jay Cook, just because he had so many incredible contradictions. He had this palatial home that he named after the chief of a local Native American tribe that he really admired, but he was also a virulent racist in some respects. Like, he wouldn't let colored people travel on his trains. His railways plowed through lots of Native American lands. They were the classic sort of the iron horses that just trampled over lots of the native lands at the time. He abhorred graft. He was incredibly religious and strict, but he also engaged in lots of graft. He was very good at bribing people. And he was incredibly rich and bought this massive palace that he built called Orgons. But his favorite thing was discussing theology with priests and fly fishing. And in his biography, he literally has like several chapters on fly fishing, and his wife is mentioned twice. And he's such a complex character. And, I like my heroes complex. I want them flawed. I want them, have good sides and bad sides. So I just remember when I was doing the research and I was writing the book, and when we were doing the podcast, I thought, wow, if I could do a podcast with Jay Cook, that would be tremendous. I'd love to talk to him about his life, his thinking, how he did these things, what it feels like to be so immensely successful. Like, this is the guy that literally Ulysses S. Grant sent a telegram saying, thanks to you, we saved the Union. He was a titanic figure. He was bigger than John Pierpont Morgan and all the Rothschilds, really. and then suddenly it all collapses in a matter of weeks.
And those
what does
two
that
names
feel like?
Those two names are mentioned all the time, aren't they?
Yeah.
J.P. Morgan, Rothschilds. Yeah.
Nobody knows about Jay Cook because his rise was so big, so fast, and his collapse was so total. And he never really tried to resurrect his career. He did manage to eventually pay back all his creditors. It took many years, so he had to sell his palatial home, and he then
is it still around, his palatial home?
I think it's a school now. Actually, yes, I think it's their Oggons. And he was able to get some semblance of wealth back. This is obviously before the era of limited liability, right? So he had to pay all the creditors, he had to sort everything else, but he was bankrupted by it.
He was a sole trader. Was that the thing?
Pretty much. I mean, the banks were, it's a different type of banks those days, but it was a systemic crisis, and he died comfortable. But as he said himself, he climbed to the top of the tower, he looked around, and he walked down again, and he has no desire to return to the top of the tower. And I just think he's a fascinating character, and he'd make a banging podcast guest. So I'd love to interview him.
Okay. When's your book coming out, and what's it called again?
The book's called A Fabulous Debt, How Bonds Built the Modern World. It's coming out on September 22nd.
Great.
In all good booksellers, and hopefully a few of the bad shops as well. But,
they're the best ones to get your books
Yeah,
into.
I know. I love proper bookshops.
Robin, remind us again the name of your podcast, and I assume people can get it wherever they get podcasts.
Yes, it's called The Story of Money. It's now also a vodcast, because that's the future of podcasts, it seems. So we are, in addition to all the obvious podcasting platforms, we're also on YouTube. There's a separate channel there people can follow, comment, say they don't like my hair, whatever. I do try to read all the comments because I like that part of it. I feel it's more interactive. It feels like a two-way conversation.
Yes, well, you can also watch this episode of Pick of the Pods on YouTube. Please do share comments. Nice ones if you can. Nasty ones if you like. I can take it. Just before we say goodbye, I just want to remind our listeners and viewers, if you're looking to discover a great new podcast every week, sign up for Pick of the Pods, the newsletter, at pickofthepods.substack.com or on my LinkedIn page. You'll get a recommendation every week of just one podcast that you should be listening to right now. One of those recommendations was The Story of Money a few weeks ago. If you enjoyed this show, please give it a rating on your podcast app and leave a comment. Leave a comment on YouTube. I'd love to hear from you, and if I get some interesting comments, I'll be reading them out on the next episode of Pick of the Pods, the podcast. Pick of the Pods is produced by Spinny Hill. The music is by Far. We'll be back next month with another great podcaster, but for now, it's thank you to Robin Wigglesworth.
Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Me too. Thanks, Robin. And thanks to everyone for listening and for watching. We'll see you next month.